Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this video, we follow the heartbreaking journey of James and Diep, who have loved and raised little Nye as their own daughter. Though every moment with her feels like a blessing, their world is shaken when Nye's grandmother suddenly arrives with legal papers demanding custody. Torn between their love for Nye and the truth of her family ties, James and Diep face the impossible choice of letting her go. Stay with us until the end to witness their emotional struggle. And don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support truly means the world to us. The door creaked open, and warm light spilled into the dim room as James stepped inside. His shoulders were tired from the long drive, but the moment his eyes landed on little Nye, the exhaustion melted away. "Hi, I missed you so much," he said with a smile that carried both relief and longing. His voice was tender, deep, wrapping around the child like a protective embrace. He scooped her up in his arms, kissing her forehead again and again, as if he were making up for all the lost days apart. Nye's laughter filled the room, pure and unguarded, her tiny arms gripping James tightly around the neck, unwilling to let go. It was the kind of hug that seemed to erase distance and time in an instant. From the kitchen, Diep looked over her shoulder. She was stirring a pot of soup, the fragrant steam rising gently, but her eyes lingered on James and Nye. The corners of her lips curled into a smile, though it was laced with something heavier, a quiet sadness she tried to hide. "Cooking again?" James teased as he set Nye down, his nose twitching at the aroma drifting across the room. "Almost done," Diep answered softly. Her tone warm, but her hands moved slower than usual. Her heart wasn't in the cooking tonight, and James could sense it. He crouched beside Nye, tapping her little nose playfully. "Did you miss me?" he asked, eyebrows raised with exaggerated curiosity. Nye's eyes lit up as she nodded vigorously. "So much," she replied, her sweet voice filling the air like music. For a moment, everything felt right. The laughter, the smell of food, the patter of rain tapping against the windows. It was all familiar, comforting. James started talking about his exhausting journey, the 400 kilometers he had covered just to be here. Yet even as he spoke, there was no bitterness in his tone, no complaint. His words were threaded with a single truth. The longing to be with Diep and Nye had carried him through every mile. Then suddenly, James slapped his forehead dramatically. "Oh, I almost forgot. I bought a gift for Nye. It's still in the car. Tomorrow, I'll bring it in." His eyes twinkled with sincerity, but Diep's smile faltered just a little. A shiver crept through her, the kind of unease that made her tighten her grip on the wooden spoon. Something about the future felt uncertain, though she didn't dare speak it out loud. The storm outside grew heavier, and it seemed to echo the heaviness in Diep's heart. She set the spoon down, and after a long pause, whispered, "James, someone came today. A woman. She said she's Nye's grandmother. She brought papers. She wants to take Nye back." The words cut through the room like a blade. James froze, the smile draining from his face. His eyes darkened, his jaw tightened, and for a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a low, firm voice, he asked, Is she truly Nye's grandmother? Diep's eyes dropped to the floor. I don't know, but she looked serious, and she said she'd come back soon. James leaned back, staring into the flickering lamplight, his thoughts heavy. We'll find out the truth. I'll ask Comrade Thon to investigate. But one thing I know for sure, Nye has already suffered too much. No one will harm her again. His fists curled against his knees, the protective instinct burning in his chest. Diep nodded, though her throat felt tight, as if her tears might spill at any second. The thought of losing Nye was unbearable. James reached across the table, his voice steadier now. Tomorrow, forget everything else. I'll cancel work. We'll take Nye out. We'll make memories. Happy ones. Diep looked at him, her heart aching with gratitude and sorrow. Nye, still nibbling at her rice bowl, was blissfully unaware of the storm that loomed over her future. The next day, sunlight filtered through the trees as James held Nye's hand, leading her and Diep into a small clothing store. The racks were filled with warm coats and scarves, and the little girl's eyes sparkled with delight as she touched everything within reach. James knelt by her side, holding up a puffy jacket. Winter's coming. We need to keep you cozy, little one. His smile was wide, but his gaze carried a flicker of worry he couldn't hide. Nye twirled in front of the mirror once she tried on the new outfit, her giggles echoing through the shop. You look like a princess, James announced, causing Nye to laugh even harder. Diep stood a few steps away, smiling through misty eyes. She loved seeing them this way, carefree, happy. But deep in her chest was a heavy truth. This joy might not last. Later that afternoon, they went to the park. James pushed Nye on the swing, his voice filled with warmth. Go farther, Nye. Go as high as you can. You're braver than me. Nye squealed with joy, her laughter ringing like bells across the playground. Diep sat on a nearby bench, her gaze fixed on the two of them, her heart swelling and breaking all at once. She wanted to freeze time, to hold this moment forever. The sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the grass. James and Diep exchanged a look, an unspoken understanding that every second mattered. They were engraving these simple joys into their memories, holding on to them as if they were treasures. As evening drew near, they stopped by a small shop where customers painted statues. Nye dipped her brush into bright colors, splattering paint across a little figurine with all the excitement of a child. Diep painted too, her strokes neat and careful. James leaned against the table, declaring himself the judge. Nye's is bold and beautiful. 10 points, he exclaimed. Turning to Diep, he added with a teasing grin, Yours is elegant and delicate. 9 points. Nye laughed, hugging her painted statue like it was the greatest prize in the world. Diep smiled too, but her hands trembled slightly as she set her brush down. Then James reached into his bag. Close your eyes, Nye. I have something special for you. The little girl obeyed, giggling as she waited. James placed a sparkling princess doll into her small hands. Nye's eyes shot open, and she squealed with delight. Thank you, Uncle James, she cried, hugging him tightly. The room seemed to glow with her joy. But in the quiet corners of James and Diep's hearts, an ache grew heavier. They both knew this happiness was fragile. Tomorrow might demand a choice neither of them was ready to face. Diep blinked quickly, hiding the tears that threatened to fall. James clenched his jaw, silently wishing he could stop time, protect this little girl forever. But as twilight painted the sky outside, reality pressed closer. The gift in Nee's hands wasn't just a toy. It was a memory, a piece of their love etched into her life. And though laughter filled the room, beneath it pulsed an unspoken fear, the fear that soon they might have to let her go. The morning came heavy with silence. Diep sat by the window, staring at the horizon as the first rays of sunlight painted the sky. Her hands trembled in her lap, and though her eyes followed the drifting clouds, her thoughts were elsewhere, on Nee. James walked in quietly, his face tired but resolute. He placed a cup of tea in front of her, but she barely touched it. He sat beside her, his voice low. "They'll come today." Diep nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. She had cried through the night, muffling her sobs so Nee wouldn't hear. The pillow beside her still carried the marks of her tears. From the bedroom, the sound of little feet echoed. Nee came running out, holding her doll from yesterday. "Uncle James, look, she's still my princess." Her smile was bright, innocent, untouched by the storm looming above. James forced a grin, scooping her up. "And you're still mine," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her cheek. But his eyes betrayed the weight of the truth he couldn't hide. Diep rose, her voice breaking. How can I let her go, James? She's my daughter. We raised her. We gave her love. She calls me Mama. And now I have to return her like she's not ours." James wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "I know. I don't want to either. She feels like our child. But if that woman really is her grandmother, if she can give Nee the family she lost, then we can't hold on, no matter how much it hurts." Tears rolled down Diep's cheeks, and she shook her head. "But she doesn't know them. She only knows us. What if she cries? What if she thinks we abandoned her?" James closed his eyes, his voice breaking into a whisper. "Then she'll remember us by the love we gave her. That love doesn't disappear, Diep. It will stay with her, even if we're not by her side." The knock on the door came like a thunderclap. Diep flinched, her whole body tensing. James rose slowly, his steps heavy, and opened it. There she stood, the woman who claimed to be Nai's grandmother. Her hair was streaked with gray, her face lined with time, but her eyes were steady, searching the small home behind James. In her hand, she carried the documents once more, proof of her identity. "I've come for my granddaughter," she said softly, though her tone carried an edge of finality. James glanced back at Diep, who had pulled Nai into her arms, clutching her tightly as if the world were about to snatch her away. Nai, sensing the tension, looked between them in confusion. "Mama, Uncle James, what's happening?" Diep tried to smile through her tears, brushing Nai's hair back. "Sweetheart, your grandmother is here." Nai blinked, tilting her head. "Grandmother? But, Mama, aren't you my mama?" The words pierced Diep's heart like a blade. She hugged Nai even tighter, sobbing quietly. "You will always be my daughter in my heart." James knelt down in front of Nai, his eyes shimmering. "Listen, Nai. We love you more than anything. That will never change. But today, You need to go with your grandmother. She's your family too." Nye's small hands gripped his shirt. "No, I don't want to. I want to stay here with Mama and you." The room filled with cries, deep sobs, Nye's protests, and the heavy silence of the grandmother watching, her lips pressed together. She did not speak, but there was sorrow in her eyes too, as if she understood the pain she was causing. Finally, Diep loosened her hold. Her arms trembled as she placed Nye's small hands into her grandmother's. "Promise me," Diep said, her voice raw, "that you will care for her, love her, protect her, as we did." The grandmother nodded, her voice low. "I will. She is my blood. She will never lack love." James stood tall, though his hands shook. He forced a smile for Nye, even as tears blurred his vision. "Be strong, little one. Remember what I told you. We'll always be here, inside your heart. No one can take that away." Nye wailed, clinging to both of them as long as she could, until finally the grandmother pulled her gently away. Her cries echoed through the doorway as she was led outside, her small voice calling back, "Mama, Uncle James." The door closed, and the silence that followed was deafening. Diep collapsed to the floor, her face buried in her hands. Her sobs tore through the room, raw and unrestrained, the sound of a mother who had lost her child. James knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around her tightly. His tears fell silently onto her hair, but his voice tried to be steady. "She'll be okay. She'll be loved. That's what matters." But Diep shook her head violently. "It's not fair. We were her parents. We gave her everything. How do we just go on without her?" James held her tighter, his own heart breaking. "We go on by remembering her, by holding on to every laugh, every hug, every smile. She's part of us now, Diep. Nothing can take that away." The days that followed were a blur of emptiness. The house felt too quiet without Nye's laughter bouncing off the walls. Her toys sat untouched, her little shoes neatly lined by the door, as if waiting for her return. Diep moved through the rooms in silence, her eyes often landing on Nye's things, and every time they did, tears welled up anew. James tried to be strong, for both of them, but even he found himself staring at the empty chair at the dinner table, the silence pressing down on him. One evening, Diep sat on the porch, watching the sunset. James joined her, handing her a blanket. For a long while, they said nothing. Then Diep whispered, "Do you think she'll remember us?" James looked out at the fading light, his throat tight. "Yes, she will. Children never forget where they felt loved." Diep leaned against him, her tears silent now, replaced by a weary ache. "I just wish we could have had more time." James kissed her forehead gently. "We gave her everything we could. That's what matters. And maybe one day, she'll find her way back to us." The horizon darkened, stars beginning to twinkle. The house behind them stood quiet, but in their hearts, the memory of Nye still lived. Her laughter, her smile, the way she called them Mama and Uncle. Though they had returned her to her grandmother, they knew she would forever remain their daughter in spirit. Their love for her was not bound by blood, nor erased by distance. It was a bond etched deep into their souls, unbreakable, enduring, and eternal. and as the night sky stretched overhead, Diep whispered into the stillness, as if Ni could hear her across the miles. "We love you, my child, always."